Welcome, welcome, welcome. As I said, this webinar is recorded. My name is Eli Saltzman. I'm an associate research professor of Israel Studies at the University of Maryland and the director of the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies at College Park. I'd like to thank my colleague Avis Koyman and Srushti Suresh for all their assistance behind the scenes that makes this and other webinars possible. I would like to plug in our next webinar that is titled Jewish Activism and Advocacy in the Aftermath of October 7th. That will take place on Monday, November 25 at 6 p.m., also online, as I said. So thank you so much for joining us. We have a fantastic event for you today. The topic is the 2024 U.S. presidential elections in Israel, and we have a stellar lineup of speakers. I'll present them in a second. I'll just frame the conversation for today. One is Professor Yael Aharonov. The other speaker is Professor Yael Sternhal. I'll present them in a second, as I said. And just to frame, following the re-election, now that we know the re-election of Donald Trump and the Republican Party's successful takeover of the Senate, while the wars in the Middle East are still continuing, the future of U.S.-Israel relations stands at a critical juncture. While the House of Representatives remains undecided, still we can say that the implications of the new administration's perspective will be dramatic in the coming years. As a pivotal ally in the Middle East and as a topic that played a significant role, in my view at least, in the elections, Israel's strategic importance to the U.S. has been constant in U.S. foreign policy. Nevertheless, the nuances of that relationship shift with changes in presidential administrations, and we'll see how that manifests itself in the coming years, of course. So today we'll kind of examine how the November 24 elections may shape policy decisions, including military aid, peace negotiations, and economic partnerships. Let me please introduce, and it is a pleasure and honor to present today's speakers. First, Professor Yael Aharonov is the Michael and Elaine Serling and Friends Endowed Chair in Israel Studies, and also the director of the Michael and Elaine Serling Institute for Jewish Studies and Modern Israel, and an associate professor at James Madison College at Michigan State University. Her primary research and work are focused on topics including Israeli politics and foreign policy, Israeli society and culture, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and Israel's asymmetric wars with Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah. Very, very pertinent to our conversation today. In addition to Yael Aharonov, we have Yael Sternhal. So we have two Yaels, which is a bonus. She's an associate professor of history and American studies at Tel Aviv University, specializing in the history of the long Civil War era. Her work has won awards from the Southern Historical Association, the Organization of American Historians, the Society for Civil War Historians, and the Society of Authorship, Reading, and Publication. Beyond academia, Sternhal is a regular contributor to Haaretz. In 2024, she's currently now in the US. She'll be an Engel visiting associate professor of history at Harvard University, where she'll be teaching a class on the history of refugees in the 20th century US history, with a special emphasis on the world wars and the experience of Jewish refugees. Each panelist will have about 20-25 minutes or so to speak, and then we'll open up the conversation among ourselves in a way. We'll open the floor for this exchange. We will also collect questions from the audience, so please feel free to type those in the designated Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Professor Yael Aharonov, it is a great pleasure. Please go ahead. The virtual floor is yours, my friend. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for inviting us to be in this panel. There you are. Certainly the screen changed for me. Just as a slight aside, not very important, I've been a full professor for 2 or 3 years, but that's not of interest to most people. So we gather here at a very momentous time, and you know, as we all know, the United States and Israel have had a very strong relationship for decades. At many points, it's been called a special relationship. And so there's been a lot of continuity among different administrations. That being said, there is kind of less tension and friction when you have administrations in the United States and in Israel that have kind of similar ideologies and more similar interests. And that's the case with the upcoming President Trump, who will be inaugurated in January, and Prime Minister Netanyahu. So whereas Netanyahu really clashed with Bill Clinton and at times with Biden, despite his, his support during the past year, and with Obama at times as well, they had a better relationship, Trump and Netanyahu, in the past, and they each helped each other in the past in their elections and supported each other to be elected in different ways and throughout their administrations. When Netanyahu did congratulate Biden after a week when Biden was elected. Trump was furious at him for doing so. But as a whole, they've had a good relationship. And at least based on the last Trump administration and Netanyahu government, one could expect that largely we're going to continue to have a good relationship between the two governments. That being said, as an aside, I will say that I think that this will have likely negative effects for Israeli interests, American interests, and Palestinian interests, among others, even though it'll be largely a good relationship, I think, between the two governments. So what can we kind of gather from the last, Trump administration? And again, none of us are great at prediction, especially with Trump, who can be whimsical and who does not face a new election. It makes it even harder to kind of predict everything that Trump will do, much less at times Netanyahu will do. But based on the past, we can, I think, gather some likelihoods. By the way, it's interesting to see that I don't think in the last administration or in this administration, Trump is going to be significantly motivated at all by the votes of Jewish Americans. This time around, it seems like about 26% of Jewish Americans voted for Trump and 71% for Harris, which is about the same as it was in the last elections. And he was largely motivated by evangelical votes for his move of the embassy to Jerusalem and other things, and now he doesn't face another election. So that's not necessarily going to be the strong motivator. But nevertheless, if you look at what he did last time and review that again, he said that Israel has sovereignty over the Golan, and at different times, that's not even the language that previous Israeli governments or even the Netanyahu government had used. He, of course, moved the embassy to Jerusalem, which was in Western Jerusalem, but did not kind of condition it on any kind of progress in peace negotiations. He, of course, came up with his own Trump peace plan, which was influenced by Jared Kushner, but which diverged significantly from past Republican and Democratic administrations as to what they had brought out and what Israelis and Palestinians themselves had spent many thousands of hours and pages negotiating and getting closer and making progress in towards a two-state solution. The Trump peace plan significantly digressed from that, did not include Palestinian leadership's input in that, and they, of course, immediately rejected that. And part of it was essentially that East Jerusalem would remain in Israel's hands, with maybe some other outskirted villages being the new Palestinian capital, and that Israel would get to annex 30% of the West Bank, which was a huge divergence from the previous Clinton parameters and even the Olmert gestures in 2008, in which there would be it would be based on the 67 borders with swaps, right? But the swaps would be between 2% and 6% of the West Bank, and anything that Israel annexed, which would be far less than 30%, would be compensated. So this was a huge divergence, which arguably is in opposition to a real viable two-state solution, which of course the current Israeli government is as well. And if we look at who some of the characters might be who are influencing the Trump administration, David Friedman was the last U.S. ambassador to Israel. He supported settlements in the West Bank, again against any kind of bipartisan previous American administration stances, which were against Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And he now seems to be for a one-state solution in which people would have some kind of status like Puerto Rico, but not actually be able to vote on it among Palestinians, and is actually for, again, Israeli annexation of territory and so forth. So if he has a role again, one could see continuity in kind of Trump's support for settlements and even possibly Israeli annexation of territory. We see that Elise Stefanik will be the U.S. ambassador to United Nations. She has been very vocal in her kind of expressions that the Israeli-Hamas war is good versus evil, civilization versus barbarism, and humanity versus depravity. She criticized the Biden-Harris administration for recently waiving the restrictions on support for the Palestinian Authority because of funding to families of people who had engaged in terror. And if you again look at what the Trump administration did in the past, they essentially heaped on punishment against Palestinians. So not only did they kind of not provide any kind of real viable opportunity for a Palestinian state alongside Israel, but they cut off all assistance in the past to the Palestinians. They defunded UNRWA. They closed the consulate general. They closed the PLO office in DC, really hampering communication, any kind of communication with the Palestinian leadership. So I think what the likelihood is that we'll see again a Trump administration along with a Netanyahu administration weakening the Palestinian Authority even further, diminishing probably humanitarian assistance in Gaza as compared even to the Biden administration, and either having kind of a hands-off attitude to what the Netanyahu government does, or actually actively supporting things like settlements. So Trump has said that he wants Netanyahu to end the war before he is inaugurated in January. But what that exactly means, whether he is kind of encouraging Netanyahu to kind of almost have more engagements in Gaza before he gets in place is unclear. It's unclear when he says, wrap it up, whether he cares at all about human rights. I mean, historically, Trump has not cared about the conduct of U.S. soldiers, much less the conduct of any other soldiers. And it's also kind of what exactly is going to happen after he's inaugurated, even if the war largely ends in terms of the level of violence that is currently used, who's going to govern it. And it's likely that it's not as if violence is going to stop. And so what would he have a hands-off kind of attitude? What would that mean? So I think, another kind of likely repercussion of Trump being elected is that it's going to support the longevity of the current Netanyahu government, as they in likelihood will receive less pressure, I think, from a Trump administration. And Netanyahu can say, oh, I'm supported, by the American government and so forth. So while currently over 70% of Israelis in last polling would want Netanyahu to resign at some point, and we can look at, and I have statistics over different polls, and blame him more than anyone else in Israel for the inability to prevent and stop earlier the attacks on October 7th, I think we'll in likelihood see a longer tenure than we might have otherwise had of the current Netanyahu government. In terms of like Jewish American and Israeli interests, there are some points of unity, of course, which we saw yesterday as well with over 1,000, if not several thousand American Jews gathering, also with Israeli hostage families, and unified in trying to get a hostage release. You have those points of unification, and of course, those also lead to a policy among that many American Jews want and Israelis want of prioritizing a deal that would include a hostage release as opposed to prioritizing military victory. So, so there are these points of unity, and in some ways, the aftermath of October 7th has brought communities more together. On the other hand, most American Jews support a two-state solution and oppose Netanyahu. So there's unity among Israelis who oppose Netanyahu, and the majority of American Jews do, but there's also, of course, differences among the communities. And, you know, again, with this particular government of Netanyahu, you could foresee kind of widening gaps among some sectors of American Jews and Israel. If we look, I'm going to just quickly talk about kind of Iran and what we might expect there. I think, you know, none of us can predict that. You know, you hear some rumors that maybe, you know, there'll be pressure on Biden to respond somehow to Iran if it seems like Iran had made plans for someone to assassinate Trump, and that might happen before Trump gets elected. You know, there are, you know, it could be that certainly Trump will strengthen sanctions against Iran even further, and certainly not try to curtail and perhaps Israel's response to a potential Iranian response to its previous attack. On the other hand, he's not necessarily interested, Trump, in a larger war between Israel and Iran that the US might get sucked into, and it doesn't seem like the vice president is necessarily either. So, so it's kind of an unknown, I think, with Iran, but it's certainly a dangerous situation. Especially, yeah, it's certainly something to be very concerned about. And if you look at, you know, I'm kind of portraying a positive picture for relationships between the American and Israeli government in all likelihood, but a negative portrayal of my, and maybe I shouldn't be talking about this, subjective, but many Israelis and American Jews' perception and Americans' perceptions of their own interests and Palestinian interests in the future getting a Palestinian state. Then you know, I've been kind of also portraying a bleak picture in terms of those perceptions of those interests. So are there any kind of opportunities for hope in any way? And I think there may be. I mean, it's already seems like there is some, there's been some progress in the Israeli-Lebanese negotiations to try to have a ceasefire between, you know, in terms of Israel, Lebanese, Israel, Hezbollah, and it seems like the current Hezbollah leader has agreed to decouple negotiations over a ceasefire in that realm from a ceasefire in Gaza, which leaves more openings to a successful negotiation there. Whether it's having strengthened Lebanese troops there, whether it has strengthened UNIFIL troops there from Resolution 1701 after the 2006 war never actually fulfilled their mandate there, and so forth. It's possible that Biden may make progress before Trump comes in, or that when Trump's in, that certainly there could be progress and you know, at least a ceasefire along a more prolonged ceasefire again on that border. You know, Trump has a strong relationship with the Saudi government, and perhaps that strong relationship could, as it did in the last Trump administration, influence him to kind of curtail some more advances on the part of the current Israeli government, parts of whom want to resettle parts of the Gaza Strip and continue settlements in the West Bank, or even annex a part of the West Bank. And just like some of those gestures in terms of settlements, annexation, are what prompted in part the Abraham Accords that were in some senses initiated by the UAE as to also get closer to the US and get fighter planes from the US, but also to curtail Israel from that annexation idea. It's possible that, again, we could see Saudi pressure and the Trump relationship with Saudi Arabia in curtailing the current Israeli government from doing more of what it would like to do that would really obstruct a future path to a two-state solution. And so that is possible. It's possible that if we have, we already have a Republican Senate now, and it seems likely that we'll get a Republican House, and that therefore Netanyahu won't be able to play the Congress against Trump, and that if any times there is disagreement between Netanyahu and Trump, he will have a harder time perhaps saying no to Netanyahu, and therefore there could perhaps be a leverage there. And it also seems to be that, very possible that as the wars drag on and so forth, and the hostages don't come back, and there's no more visible plan, and the immediate threat of an Iranian attack goes by, that you would again get kind of greater resistance and demonstrations and calling for new elections in Israel. Again, it's not necessarily likely in the next 3 months, but one could also, and I think that the likelihood is that a Trump administration is going to lengthen the tenure of Netanyahu's government. Nevertheless, there are, I think, going to be limits to that as well, right? In July, poll in the Times of Israel indicated that 72% of Israelis thought Netanyahu should resign over the October 7th failures. 44% believe Netanyahu needs to quit immediately, and 28% believe he should resign when the war ends, right? And interestingly, 50% of those who define themselves as supporters of the government believe that he must leave office before his term. So I know he got a little bit of a boost after the assassination of Nasrallah and so forth. But nevertheless, you have a real underlying dissatisfaction with Netanyahu as well. And again, 39% of Israelis hold Netanyahu as the most responsible for October 7th. And the statistics after that are just 18% for the former military intelligence chief, 10% for the IDF, 7% for the Shin Bet, etc. So he by far is held most accountable for October 7th. So there is that underlying dissatisfaction and anger. And so you could still see potentially with his firing of Galant, and with the prolongation of the war, and with no absolute victory that will be seen in terms of absolute end to violence, and if hostages aren't returned, you can have a combination of things that put more pressure on the government. And certainly one of those things Netanyahu is trying, as he succeeded in the past, of delaying his trial that's supposed to happen on December 1st, where he would actually have to provide testimony, that it would be recorded, that the police could bring things more out about his trials, indictments against him, that he could be held, to be liable of perjury and other things. So he's trying to delay that. If he is unable to delay that, if there's more pressure for an independent commission on responsibility for October 7th, there could be all kinds of things that come into place that could, and it could be from the coalition itself. If, now again, it seems more likely with the firing of Galant and what's happening in the Knesset today, that now again, any kind of pressures from the ultra-Orthodox parties in terms of resisting drafts and not wanting, and resisting payments, policies that would decrease payments to their kids if they get out of the draft, as well as the rabbi's law, which could employ, I don't know, 1,000 Shas people to have more influence over the election of municipal rabbis and things like that. So there are all kinds of issues like that come to the Knesset. And now with the firing of Galant and Sa'ar, Netanyahu seems to have more success, perhaps, in getting those things through. But there's always the potential of members of Knesset or a party leaving the coalition. He himself, Netanyahu, might call for new elections at some point if he thinks it can happen. So it's not necessarily likely we're going to see elections soon, but there's certainly, I guess, some room and for optimism in terms of new elections. But the potential for new elections is a combination of regional issues and potential pressure from even Trump himself, given his relationship with Saudi Arabia at some point, that would curtail or prevent some actions that parties in Netanyahu's coalition want to influence, that he even wouldn't be able to do what Trump wants him to do at certain points, which might cause greater friction. So there's so much more to talk about, but I'll leave it at there. Probable good relations between Netanyahu and Trump and the Israeli government, but with potential negative consequences for many other Israeli interests, American interests, and certainly Palestinian interests as well.
Thank you so much, Professor Aronoff, for your take. We'll switch and move now to Professor Yael Sternhal, there you go. She's now unmuted. Go ahead, my friend.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. Thank you. Yeah, that was really illuminating. So I'm going to try and offer some thoughts that might in some ways connect with all of what you've just offered. From my perspective as an Israeli academic, I am not an expert on Israel academically, but I do spend quite much time thinking about the connections between global history more generally and Israel, and this is what I have to offer at this particular point in time. So, I mean, I think the first thing to realize is that on the Israeli right, there has been quite a bit of rejoicing in recent days since Trump's election, because the Israeli right, and I want to say even the center right, and I tend to be much more careful than some commentators in the US about speaking about Israel as a monolith, about Israelis as a monolith, because Israel, as we all know, has first and foremost a 20% Palestinian minority, and then also a minority of Israeli leftists, liberals, progressives, however you wish to name them, which are indeed numerically at this point in time not an enormously significant group, but it is significant in other ways, and it holds quite a bit of power and authority in important nodes in Israeli life, and so it is important to me to make these distinctions and to clarify that not all Israelis see things in the same way. But certainly on the Israeli right and on the center right, there's a great deal of satisfaction over Trump's election. Israelis supported Trump. I think they may be the only nation in the world which supported Trump to this extent. And partly that's because, or not even partly, wholly because many Israelis see the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a zero-sum game. And therefore, the Democratic Party, being sensitive as it is to minority rights, to historical injustice, to question of historical responsibility, and therefore sensitive to Palestinian demands, rights, interests, is seen as fundamentally the enemy. Now, that is really absurd, considering the steadfast support of the Biden administration of Israel during this entire war, both morally, financially, logistically. Israel cannot fight this war without active American support, which has been the cause of much consternation and anger on many an American campus, as we know. But it is important to understand that despite all of this support, which is reported and proven, it's not a secret in Israel that the Biden administration has been very supportive. And in the first few days after October 7th, many Israelis really were grateful for the kind of comfort and deep empathy that Joe Biden was affording, the fact that he showed up physically in Israel to show his support. You know, at that time, at that particular moment, especially since Israel's own prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has been hiding from the public, has not given a single interview to a mainstream Israeli news organization since October 7th, Biden's kind of just sense of, you know, simple humanity and sympathy with the plight of everyday Israelis was really touching. And then it was accompanied by a year and counting of steadfast financial and military support. However, many Israelis still think that because the Biden administration also sees the other side of the conflict, and the Democratic Party sees the other side of the conflict, that makes it automatically into an enemy of Israeli interests, and hence the rejoicing on the Israeli right. And then another reason for rejoicing is the fact that the Biden administration, while it has failed to end the war, it has been very active in sanctioning and taking active measures against the radical elements of the settler movement in Israel. Those settlers who have a well-documented record of unsolicited, unjustifiable violence against helpless Palestinians. And the Biden administration has taken unprecedented steps against these individuals and a couple of entities. And that has enraged the settler movement and enraged that mainstream Israelis actually support these moves. All polling shows that this is the case, that there is a great deal of support among the mainstream Israeli public for curtailing the uncontrolled actions of the radical elements of the settler movement. But that will now most likely end. And that is a source of great satisfaction for those elements on the Israeli right, which would like to preserve a total freedom for Israeli settlers in the occupied territories to behave as they please. Now, the war. So, I mean, I see two scenarios, which are both in some ways very likely, or there will be some weird combination thereof. Like Yael A was saying earlier, Trump is so whimsical, so unexpected, so devoid of any real ideological commitment or any commitment to process and formal policy, that it really is hard to guess where things will go. But I see one scenario in which the Trump administration will allow Israel to simply do as it pleases in Gaza. If that means permanent control of northern Gaza, so be it. If that means setting up permanent military outposts, which will then be accompanied by civilian presence and the onset of settlement in northern Gaza by civilians who will receive the stamp of approval and, of course, the protection of the Israeli state, I can see the Trump administration signing off on that too. I see also a different scenario in which Trump, who watches a lot of television, will say something that he has already said during the campaign. And one little tidbit that has really caught my eye, and he said, "This war does not photograph well. It doesn't look good." Now, we all know that for Donald Trump, the way things look, the way people look, matters a great deal. And the war in Gaza is, I mean, we all know what it is. It's a humanitarian catastrophe, and it photographs as such. And I can see a scenario in which the Trump administration will simply let the Israeli government know that it is no longer interested in taking part in a war that does not photograph well, and that has not seemed to end in any real accomplishments. The Israeli hostages are still in Gaza. Hamas has been defeated in some ways, but is rebuilding in others. It is in some way the war has ended inconclusively, or in a kind of terrible stalemate. And so I can totally see a situation in which Trump will simply say the US does not want any part in it. The US does not want to spend money there. The US does not want to spend capital there, political capital. And here is the Saudi angle, which Yael also mentioned. The Trump administration, I assume, will have strong ties to Saudi Arabia. We know that Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, has maintained a very active relationship through his business dealings with different elements in Saudi Arabia. And so I can really see the Saudis becoming an actor even more so than they have been so far. And they have been an actor and could have also been an actor on a path to a resolution of the conflict back in the winter, when an easier resolution of this war still seemed possible in late 2023. But I can see Trump allowing the Saudis to take up much more space and be much more active in controlling the situation on the ground. Now, there's also the possibility that the Trump administration will demand from Israel to end the war, but will allow Israel to end the war on terms that will be very favorable to what the current Israeli government wants, and that will make the ending of the war in some ways meaningless for hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who will still be homeless because their houses in northern Gaza are destroyed, and because Israel will not allow them to come back there. Indeed, I do not see Donald Trump or anyone in his administration developing any kind of deep interest in the humanity, the rights of Palestinians in Gaza, of unarmed civilians who just want to go home. And in that way, we could see a kind of a sort of a very unsatisfying middle ground in which the US will demand Israel to end the war, but will allow it to end the war in ways that will not resolve the disaster taking place in Gaza. Now, I want to talk about what will happen within the federal government and how that will influence the situation on the ground in the Middle East. Now, historically, as we all know, there has been a great deal of continuity between American administrations. It's true, and this is again speaking to Yael's point about moving the embassy and recognizing the Golan Heights as an Israeli as part of Israel. These have been major shifts away from traditional American positions, but they have been largely symbolic. When Israelis claim that the moving the embassy to Jerusalem is a great accomplishment of Israeli foreign policy and a great accomplishment for Benjamin Netanyahu personally, my response is usually, well, okay, so the embassy's in Jerusalem. Has that made your life any better? Are there more teachers in Israeli schools? Are there more doctors in Israeli hospitals? Are you feeling safer vis-a-vis the prospect of war? These were symbolic gestures. I'm not saying that they were meaningless, not at all. Of course, symbols have meaning. But when it came to policy, there has traditionally been a great deal of continuity between American administrations. And though Israelis, again, in large part, see Democrats as the enemy and Republicans as a dear friend, most of the time, Pentagon officials, Department of State officials have had a great deal of influence on American policy. The American army which has a close relationship with the Israeli army. In some ways, the relationship doesn't just work on the level of the principles, meaning the leader of Israel, the leader of the United States, the secretaries of defense on both sides. It works on much lower levels where the actual work of diplomacy and the actual work of arms trading and finance works. And to me, the great question right now, in that sense, is whether Trump will actually follow up or follow through with his campaign promise to empty out the American civil service. Does that mean that the Department of State will be hollowed out and will then be filled with political appointees? What does that mean for the Department of Defense? What does that mean for the armed forces? Are the people leading, the professional military men leading America's armed forces, will they now also be political appointees? Will one need to pass some kind of loyalty test in order to advance in the ranks of the American armed forces? I'm just not quite sure how this will look like in reality, and I think that it might have a huge impact on the relationship, and in some ways on the ability of the United States to help Israel, to defend Israel. And so I have a lot of questions about that angle of the emerging Trump administration. Will there now not be professionals doing that work? What will the major security bodies within the White House look like? All of these are questions that I would that I am really anxious to see the answers for. One more angle that I want to bring up is the European Union vis-a-vis the new Trump administration. So, the European Union, we all, like all of us observing the United States, it was clear that a Trump victory was a very reasonable outcome of this very close election. And so I assume that they too had been preparing for this. And I read that they're already taking initial steps to try and figure out how to run that relationship now with the new Trump administration. But the question for me, as someone who's invested in resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and in peace and prosperity for everyone living in that beautiful and tortured part of the earth, the answer to me is whether the EU will resist the Trump administration's policies on Israel-Palestine, if indeed they will be wholly supportive of the Netanyahu government and its radical agenda, or will the EU take up the United States, whether the EU will break with the US and conduct an independent policy vis-a-vis Israel now that this administration will come to power. Another question that I think is incredibly important is what will happen internally in the United States. It has been, at least here in my own city for this year, Cambridge, Massachusetts, things have been incredibly peaceful. There's no one on the streets. The day after the election, classes just started at 9 o'clock in the morning, and people just went to class. The question is whether, when Trump takes office, this will be the case, and how unstable the United States will become. Will the Trump administration basically be a continuation of the previous one, in the sense that there will be political warfare in Washington, but life will go on pretty much as it always does in this huge country, which is so decentralized, in which federalism is a real thing, and life takes place largely within state boundaries rather than in a national framework? So that, yes, that will leave the United States as an important actor in the Middle East, and as an actor that can actually determine, let's say, how the war will end and when it will end. But if the United States in and of itself becomes unstable, if what we will see is, for example, instances in which the Trump administration will order federal forces to round up and arrest immigrants and place them in camps awaiting deportation. And state governors will try to resist, or mayors will try to resist, or the public will try to resist. And we will see instances of instability, the likes of which, we have not seen here maybe since the Civil War. Then I think that will have a huge impact on the ability of the United States to function in the Middle East. And so thinking about both Israel as an Israeli historian, but also about the United States as a scholar of the long Civil War era, I do wonder whether this is the quiet before the storm, and whether the United States is about to become much less stable and much more violent internally, in a way that would have a huge impact on its ability to remain a constructive actor worldwide. And then maybe one final thought, and I want to leave enough room for questions, because I know people have questions, and I prefer to be in dialogue rather than to pontificate. But I do want to say that for those of us who have been wanting to see the war end, want to see the dying on both sides end, want safety and prosperity for everyone, for those of us who don't see the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a zero-sum game. The Biden administration has largely failed in containing the war, in containing the Netanyahu administration, in containing, in putting down more firm guidelines for how the war should be fought and when the war should end. And in some ways, though, both Biden and the people he works with, Joe Sullivan, Anthony Blinken, I think really do have at heart the best interests of both Israelis and Palestinians, would really like to see this conflict resolved in a fair way. And if not resolved, at least for the moment, just end the violence and let refugees on all sides come back home. Let people in northern Israel come back home. Let people in northern Gaza come back home. Just, restore whatever it is that we had before October 7th, which wasn't much, but it's a hell of a lot better than what we have now. It has failed to do so. And in that sense, I don't know that the Trump administration will necessarily do more or less than what the Biden administration has done. And I think if all this work, if all this goodwill, if the numerous trips these officials had taken to the region have produced so little in the way of limiting this brutal war from destroying the lives of so many on both sides of the Israel-Palestine divide, then it's just unclear to me that the Trump administration will necessarily be that different, or will be able to make a real impact, even if there is motivation, even if there is an interest on the side of Donald Trump himself and the people surrounding him in seeing this war come to a close and pulling the U.S. out of it to the extent that it is an actor in it. The U.S. has been an actor, but it certainly has not felt this way. And so I wonder whether the difference will be as felt as we assume it would be, considering how radical the transition between the Biden administration and the Trump administration is going to be in so many other ways of American life. So I'll end there, and looking forward to questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor Aronov, Professor Sternhofer, for excellent comments. There's some questions in the Q&A, but as the moderator, in a way, I'll take advantage of my unlimited power, and rather than talk about
the spirit of these days.
Absolutely, I'm going to be a dictator only on day one. But let me ask this: we talked a lot about a Trump administration and its relationship with Israel. Can I take a step back and ask, what does the Biden administration look like vis-a-vis Israel in the next couple of months, right? Biden still has time until January 20th. And we've seen in the past, at least, that presidents oftentimes, the equivalent of the October surprise, there might be kind of a December or January surprise, so to speak. Let's start with Professor Aronov. You go ahead, my friend.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I was thinking along the same lines as you were talking also, Professor Sternhell, and I thought they were very insightful comments. I mean, I think there could be an incentive, right, for the Biden administration to put a little more pressure on the current government towards the end of its term. Certainly in the last month, it's probably held back a little bit because of the upcoming elections. And if you look at the influence of elections on, U.S.-Israeli relations, on progress in Israeli-Palestinian peace, often elections can be a hindrance to that progress because of election concerns. And so I think that there could be more pressure put on the Netanyahu government by the Biden administration in the next couple of months. And certainly there's already that pressure on increasing humanitarian assistance in Gaza. Otherwise, the Israeli government would face limitations on weapons transfers and so forth. And that certainly could come to be since the Biden administration's calculation so far is that Israel has not let in the humanitarian assistance that the Biden administration is insisting on. There also could be things in the UN or UN Security Council that perhaps the US doesn't veto. There could be, I mean, it's interesting to see what the dynamics will be if Qatar is saying it's no longer going to mediate negotiations between Israel and Hamas because neither party has done enough to reach a negotiation. To what extent it's the impact of the Biden administration putting more pressure on Qatar, or to what extent it's Qatar trying to pressure the Biden administration and others, or Hamas. So it's, we're not privy to all the ins and outs of that. But that might also curtail to some degree who's going to negotiate on the part of Hamas, who's going to mediate if Qatar steps away. And therefore, even if the Biden administration wanted to put more pressure on getting a deal and a hostage release and end to the war, what it can do in terms of Qatar's current position. But there could be a possibility for increased pressure in the next couple of months. Long-winded way of saying that.
I hear you. Alrighty, Estela, how do you see it? Is there kind of anything that I didn't do so far I can do now more forcibly, or is it
I don't
just...
know. After Biden stepped down in July, this is what some commentators in Israel were saying, that now that he's no longer bound to the re-election campaign, he can do whatever the hell he wants. And I remember him swearing at Netanyahu at a phone call, or at least reading reports that he had sworn at Netanyahu on a phone call, basically pointing out that Netanyahu simply is not telling him the truth. But what is that really amounted to? I mean, right, like Professor Aronov is right that there's more pressure on letting in humanitarian aid, but it's really all so marginal, right? I mean, it doesn't seem that the US is resisting what seems like at this point the beginnings of a permanent control of the Israeli army over parts of the Gaza Strip. I just don't see the US saying, we're not going to fund this, or you cannot use American weapons. I don't. And so therefore maybe, but I would not hold my breath.
Alrighty, I think that's good enough. Alrighty, good friends of ours raised a couple of questions in the Q&A. Question to Professor Aronov: assuming that the majority in the House would also be Republican, the Democrats will be out of power and with no real influence for at least 2 years until the next midterm. How do you see the Dems' future positions on Israel evolve? So not talking about Trump or the Republican Party, but rather flip it and talk, what did the elections do or will do, or the kind of the lack of access to power to the Democratic Party? With the current centrist, moderate leaving the scene, will the progressives take over specifically on Israel?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer to that, as we've all been kind of watching the news since the election and before the election. That's the big question: is who's to blame, and where will the Democratic Party go? And is it that it failed to move too much to the center, or is it that it didn't move sufficiently to the left? And so that's kind of a real question that I expect the party will continue to struggle with. And I don't think we really know the answer to that. I mean, it can really go in different directions if there's really a class difference, not class, but educational difference in terms of who voted for Trump and who voted for Harris. Then the Democratic Party will have to figure that out. But you could argue it both ways, that it needs to go maybe in a Bernie Sanders kind of direction of trying to reach a working class, or that it has to move more to the center, or in trying to appeal to others, and not having them feel like they're being talked down to and so forth. So we really don't, it's such a complex issue. I don't think I have the answer to that. I think what maybe is more likely in the future is, until there is a peace agreement with a two-state solution, I think certainly 10 years from now or so forth, if we look at our own students now on campuses, that there certainly has been a trend. They've lived under their whole lives have been under the Netanyahu government. They're on social media. Their vision of things are very much seen through all the wars between Israel and Hamas, and certainly the current one as well. And as probably many of us who teach on campuses can see, is that there's an increased trend, not only of critiquing Israel's conduct in the war, which many, people can do to varying degrees, but also Israel's existence itself. And I think there's a lot more conversation and challenge of Israel's existence itself. And if you think that all these students will have more influence in future governments and influence on voting, that could speak to differences in terms of, or a weakening of kind of support for Israel, regardless of who's in government, or who, and there could be long-term or medium-term or pressure on Israel until there is a peace agreement. But that's just
I hear you. Yeah, I think that you published an op-ed for Haaretz, I think it was a couple of days ago, basically arguing it was kind of, to quote James Carville, it was the economy stupid kind of a thing, right? That the Democrats lost because of that. But are there other issues kind of tying it all?
I was trying to, say as much as I could in 700 words, which is always a challenge. I think that certainly for some Trump voters in this cycle, it was the economy. They just cannot live with the grocery bill that they find themselves with on every trip to the store. So I think there is that element too. But I think that and this ties to Professor Aronov's point as well, that a sense of realignment in American politics is based in fact, that the move of Latino men in the direction of the Republican Party, their admiration for Trump, or their at least acquiescence in what Trump is offering, even when it means deporting people in their own communities, right? I wonder what that realignment will mean for Israel-Palestine policy. I wonder whether the Democratic Party will indeed move to the center, but the progressive wing in the Democratic Party, and especially those who prioritize Israel-Palestine as a topic will rebel against this movement. And I'm wondering whether we are, we may be seeing the birth of a new political order, as historian Gary Gerstle has been suggesting, that issues are going to look differently in future elections than they have so far. And what would that mean? And what would the isolationism of the Republican Party, which we've seen for a while, but will certainly may certainly become a much more prominent feature. What will that mean for Israel-Palestine? Will we see the birth of a new political party? Will we see I think that this election is such a wake-up call for the Democratic Party. This has been said through and through over the last few days. This is not 2016. This is not a fluke. This is not an accident. Donald Trump has the popular vote, and he's a known entity at this point. The voters knew whom they were returning to the White House. And so this will demand a rethinking. And I think that rethinking may end up having an impact on foreign policy as well. I just don't know if I can predict it. I mean, will the Democratic Party, get involved now that, it's in the next election, it's no longer going to be Trump? Will there be an internal ideological war within the Democratic Party around Israel-Palestine? We've heard a lot of talk this cycle that the Democratic Party is united around its opposition to Trump. And once Trump is out of the game, all hell will break loose. Will that be the case around Israel-Palestine too? I mean, I'm just bringing these up as possible scenarios. Clearly historians cannot predict the future. No one can, in fact. But I think it's scenarios worth contemplating.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly the classical quote about the prediction is that it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. This is Yogi Berra, which is very interesting because Niels Bohr had a very similar comment about predictions and the future. We have one question from David Siegel, who's a good friend of ours here at the Gildenhorn Institute, a great supporter of ours. What are the potential implications of a Trump-Netanyahu access for the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, which has frequently being violated during the Gaza war? And if I can ask, and I think that Professor Aharonov kind of mentioned the Abraham Accords, can you talk about perhaps, about the regional setting? What does it mean? What are people expecting to happen now with regards to the Middle East, kind of more broadly, beyond Israel, while Israel is a major part of it, of course?
No, that's a great question. I mean, luckily, the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty continues to hold, and there were questions about that. When Mubarak was first ousted and we had a Muslim Brotherhood president in Egypt, and in fact, the relationship really did not weaken during that time, and hasn't. Now, in terms of public opinion, there'll be pressure in Egypt, if the war doesn't end or if Israel starts to annex part of Gaza. But of course, the current Egyptian government actually categorizes Hamas as a terror organization and sees the Muslim Brotherhood, to which it's affiliated, as a threat to its own regime, and has often, of course, closed its own border in many ways to Gaza. And of course, part of the humanitarian disaster is that it hasn't opened its doors at various points where it could to refugees either, if they could have been tied to an Israeli promise to have them return at a certain point. Nevertheless, you could see either public opinion or the government reevaluating perhaps certain things in terms of if Israel is just going to govern it itself or occupy it itself without trying to have participation in Gaza of the Palestinian Authority or other troops or regional troops or international troops. And it's solely under Israeli control. That will certainly strain the relationship. But I'm not so sure that in the immediate term it will unravel. And certainly the Egyptian government is trusted to some extent by both Israelis and Palestinians, and really has a constructive role to play, and often has played a constructive role in trying to bring about ceasefires, and trying to perhaps play a role in the future, border controls and measures and stuff that could provide assurances and security and perhaps reconstruction. So it's always possible that under various scenarios that it could unravel, but I'm actually more optimistic that that may be a mechanism. I'm also an eternal optimist, despite the many the
God knows
many
I need that.
challenges, but I do believe in hope, and I do think Egypt can continue to play a constructive role, also with both Trump and Netanyahu and Palestinian leaderships, to at least keep worse things from happening, and trying to keep openings for reconstruction in Gaza, and perhaps at least a multilateral at some point control, until you have Palestinian leadership, take over, that can be linked to security assurances. So I think it is something to consider as the possibility of it unraveling, but I don't necessarily think it's likely in the near term, and I'm hoping that it won't. Yeah.
Sure. So Professor Sternhag, you can chime in on that, but let me ask you a question now that you're here, and again, I don't want to put you on the spot as the kind of the Israeli who's kind of in the room, although I'm also Israeli. What do you think Israelis get wrong about the elections, or perhaps about the shift that we've seen in the past, certainly in the past few days, in terms of American politics, society? Again, some of the kind of the historically, the special relationship between the United States and Israel was not just about strategic relations. There was other layers, kind of social, political, cultural. Do you think that there's something that Israelis are missing in the way that they perceive that?
Look, I mean, again, Israelis is a big word, but when I speak about the majority of Israelis who now identify with the right, I think that there's been a lot of panic, moral and otherwise, about the movement left on Israeli campuses and among Israeli and among Americans beyond campuses. And, I think there have been very troubling elements of that, troubling to me personally, hurtful to me personally, hurtful to friends of mine, hurtful to students I know. But I think that Israelis have misjudged for a long time how Israel's control of the occupied territories and its greater humanitarian implications is seen abroad. I mean, I think Israelis really misjudged and continue to misjudge how they are seen, because many Israelis simply refuse to consider the other side's perspective of the war. They are locked into this view of the zero-sum game. They are locked into the view of this being an irresolvable conflict, and therefore they cannot fathom that people can be fundamentally for a just solution to the conflict and not hate Israel. That wanting a solution, wanting things to be different, does not mean hating Israel. It means wanting things on the ground to be different. I think also because I'm really bothered by the fact that the Israeli media does not at all reflect to Israelis what the war actually is in Gaza. There are no images of Gaza that contain any visuals that would be painful for Israeli eyes. So Israelis do not see the dead children. They do not see the hungry mothers. They do not see the grieving fathers. All they see is rubble. Gaza photographs to Israelis, Gaza translates to Israelis as simply rubble without any human beings. Where are the human beings? I don't know, they're gone, but they're not suffering. And so I think that's made it very hard for Israelis to understand how the war is being seen outside, and why It has aroused so much anger and frustration among Americans, even Americans who care about Israel, who wants Israel's long-term existence and prosperity. So I think that's one huge disconnect. And I think that, you know, in the same way that many Americans are willing to take their chances with Donald Trump, despite everything they've seen from him, despite the fact that he told them to inject bleach during COVID and has tried to incite a rebellion against the government and destroy the country's constitutional order. They're still willing to take a chance on him. Israelis who know even less about Donald Trump also see him as a kind of possible savior for Israel, and the leader who will finally let Israel control the situation on the ground and do whatever it pleases. And it's honestly just entirely tragic to me as someone who will go back to Israel this summer and face the consequences of that. Because letting Israel roam free in the region has not brought peace and prosperity, neither to Israelis nor to anyone around Israel. And in the end, we are all connected. The suffering of one side eventually, you know, translates into the suffering of the other side too. And we've seen it play out on both ends of this tragic conflict. And so I think, you know, there's, you know, it's always interesting because Israelis see themselves as uniquely attached to America. They like to think of themselves as the 51st state. Israelis are largely very devoted to American culture, are, you know, live very much within America's kind of broader cultural umbrella. And yet they don't read American media. I've met very few Israelis who actually read the New York Times or actually watch, you know, Fox News. They read and watch whatever is being translated to them into Hebrew. And so their understanding of the kind of the deep currents in American culture is actually pretty flawed. And, you know, I try to do my part to, you know, bridge that gap, as do all other Americanists in Israel, my wonderful colleagues at Tel Aviv University and in other universities. But at the end of the day, you know, we're a drop in the ocean. And so I think both the resistance to Israel is completely incomprehensible. The discomfort with Israel is incomprehensible, and also just the nature of what has just happened, and the risks to the world order, the risks to the fate of liberal democracy are also largely hidden from sight for those who are just happy because Donald Trump will let Netanyahu you know, do whatever he feels like and whatever he thinks is best for Israel's interests.
Alrighty, we have a couple of more minutes, and I'd like to kind of present a challenge very briefly, if you can. Oftentimes, academics are perceived as kind of disconnected ivory tower. Can you think about ways in which or through which your work can shed light on the topic, on the relationship between the United States and Israel? And I'm going to help Professor Aharonov in a way. She focused, for example, about the way that hawks become doves, or this kind of moderation over time. Do you see that as a pathway in Israel or here in the United States? And Professor Sternhell, kind of, you know, your work focuses on the civil war here in the United States. Is there something that we can use that experience to understand kind of the trajectory of the relationship? Professor Aharonov first, please.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think in some ways I've also kind of written on the political psychology of Israeli prime ministers, and certainly there are a lot of ways, if you look at the political psychology of Netanyahu, and I've done less in-depth work on Trump, but there's some similarities between the two in the way they feed off each other and copy each other and share worldview to some extent ideologically, and often sometimes hire the same campaign people. But this idea of the establishment being against you, and that, and that's something Professor Stern was talking in terms of Trump and the potential impacts on the federal bureaucracy. But we see in both places as a real emphasis on loyalty, right, of people who work for you, and dismissal or resigning, or people not remaining actually loyal in many respects, of people who work for them to the leaders. They both have a sense of curtailing kind of the media, the independence of the media, and castigating academic institutions, castigating, other bureaucrats, castigating the Defense Department itself and the military and intelligence itself. And part of it is kind of a larger populist movement, nationalist populist, that we see in various countries around the world that both Netanyahu and Trump are part of. But part of it is also, I think, some of their personality traits, with Netanyahu being kind of immersed in kind of this past that kind of abets and strengthens his already kind of realpolitik outlook on the world. The fact that he neither kind of has the emotional intelligence, like, is open to critique, right? Not only from other countries, as Professor Stenoha was talking about, but also in terms of other parties or other quarters or within their advisors. They don't want to have kind of diversity of opinion and people challenging them. And it used to be that I would say that Trump was less risk averse than Netanyahu, and Netanyahu was more risk averse, and Trump may be less so and more mercurial. But since Netanyahu's indictments a few years ago and his potential coming to trial, I mean, he always prioritized staying in power, but now he's also prioritizing the potential of staying out of jail. We saw that commonality between Netanyahu and Trump, as well as now, like, oh, what's going to happen, that he's going to become President Trump? Will the lawsuits against him kind of wither away and be dropped and so forth? And certainly since the trials and that additional kind of interest on the part of Netanyahu, in some ways he's become less risk averse than he used to be, and more risk prone, both in terms of war and the length of war and other things that he might look at, and keeping his coalition together. And so they have some common ideological and personality traits. They feed off each other and kind of strengthen each other in some ways along those lines. But also that risk propensity on the part of Trump, and increasing risk propensity on the part of Netanyahu, alongside not really listening to opponents and just listening to yes men that they surround themselves with, is a dangerous recipe. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor Aharonov. Jens Sternhal, something, a prism through which we can understand the present as a historian?
So, just very briefly, the civil war is in some way, a historical case study for a conflict that was entirely unexpected. The slaveholders reigned supreme in the 1840s and 50s. The United States was expanding. Slavery was exploding. Its future seemed bright. And slaveholders were incredibly confident in their ability to basically control reality in a way that would serve their interests and perpetuate the system that they had built. And then public opinion shifted and turned, and a chain of events caused the Civil War to break out, and during that war, slavery collapsed. And so in some ways, Yael was talking about optimism. I try very hard to remain an optimist, despite, the world being what it is. And I do still believe in deep contingency, in the fundamental unpredictability of human history. And the fact that at this moment in time, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict seems irresolvable, and the Israeli right seems to be reigning supreme, and has been hugely optimistic about its odds in the second Donald Trump era. Yes, this is the constellation at this moment, but it does not mean that this is what things are going to look like 5 or 10 years from now. The thought of immediate emancipation all over the United States would have been completely unthinkable in 1853 and even in 1858. And then, one thing led to another, a chain of events took place, and, we ended up in 1863. So I cling to that idea that the unpredictability of history, the historical pendulum, we have no idea what things will look like, and even public opinion can shift and can shift big time, depending on how circumstances evolve.
All righty. So in that very optimistic, or not very moderately optimistic note, we can bring this special webinar to a close. I want to thank you both, Yael Aharonov and Yael Sternhal, for your participation, for your insights, and the way that you framed the conversations about this relationship in light of the recent elections. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to the audience for attending. This recording will be uploaded to YouTube in the coming days, and I look forward to seeing you in our next events, both online and in person. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you so much to the speakers. I appreciate you very much. Take care. All the best.